Evan Calloway had flown through the night just to place a sealed letter into the hands of billionaire Graham Ashcroft. But before he could step into the boardroom, CEO Vivian Blackwood snatched the envelope from him, mocked his faded uniform in front of the entire board, and tore the letter to pieces without reading past the first line. She had no idea that the quiet man watching from behind the dark glass was Graham himself. He had seen all of it, the contempt, the lie that followed, and one small detail buried in that letter that was strong enough to bring down her entire empire. Before the secret inside that letter comes to light, stay close, because what happens next changes everything for a man nobody in that building thought was worth looking at twice. The sky over Seattle was still the color of ash when Evan Calloway brought the small transport plane down onto the runway, the wheels kissing the tarmac with the kind of practiced gentleness that came from 20 years of flying through weather most pilots refused to touch. He had been in the air since well before midnight, crossing from a small, wind-scored airfield in Montana with nothing but a folded map, a thermos of burnt coffee, and a sealed envelope tucked deep inside his jacket. The envelope was heavier than paper had any right to be, its wax seal stamped with the letter A in a design Evan recognized from every Ashcroft Aeronautics building he had ever flown cargo past. He did not know what was written inside it, and he had been told in no uncertain terms not to ask. All he knew was that a man named Nathaniel Voss had pressed it into his hands with trembling fingers and a voice that had no room left for negotiation. The cabin still smelled of cold metal and burnt coffee, and Evan's shoulders ached in that particular way that came only from hours spent gripping a yoke through turbulence no passenger would have tolerated without complaint. He had not slept, not really, though he had allowed himself a few stolen minutes somewhere over the Idaho panhandle when the sky finally settled and the stars felt close enough to touch. Flying alone at night did strange things to a man's thoughts, pulling old memories up from wherever he kept them buried, and more than once during the crossing he had caught himself thinking of his late wife's voice, steady and warm, the way it used to sound before everything changed. He pushed the thought aside the way he always did, focusing instead on the instruments glowing faintly in front of him, the compass needle holding true, the envelope pressing against his ribs like something alive. Hours earlier, in a hangar lit by a single flickering bulb, Nathaniel had told Evan that the letter needed to reach Graham Ashcroft before the 10 o'clock board meeting, and that it could not pass through anyone else's hands first. Not a secretary, not a security guard, not a single vice president standing between the lobby and the top floor. Nathaniel had once helped Evan keep his pilot's license alive during an insurance dispute that could have ended his career for good, and Evan had never forgotten the debt, even years later when Nathaniel had quietly stepped away from Ashcroft Aeronautics and out of public life. Along with the envelope, Nathaniel had slipped a small brass key into Evan's palm, offering no explanation for what it opened, only a warning that Evan would know when the time came. Evan had turned the key over twice in his fingers before pocketing it, the metal still warm from Nathaniel's grip. Just before wheels up, Evan's phone had buzzed with a call from his daughter, Audrey, her voice thin and a little unsure over the crackling connection from her dormitory 2 states away. She had asked if he thought he could make it back for the ceremony at her college. That weekend, the one where the aviation program was recognizing students for their community flight hours, the very program Evan had once nudged her toward. He told her he would try, keeping the exhaustion out of his voice the way he always did, because a man who raised a daughter alone learned early that tired was not something you handed to your child. He checked the clock on the dashboard as the call ended, doing the math on traffic and elevators, and how much runway he had left before the meeting began without him. It was only as he taxied toward the private hangar that he noticed the black sedan idling near the perimeter fence, its engine running. its driver watching him with the kind of stillness that had nothing to do with waiting for a delayed flight. Ashcroft Tower rose out of downtown Seattle in a wall of glass and steel, the kind of building that made a person feel smaller the closer they walked toward its doors. And Evan felt every inch of that smallness as he crossed the marble lobby in his worn flight jacket and scuffed boots. His duffel bag still smelled faintly of jet fuel, and dust from the runway clung to the hem of his slacks in a way that drew stares from men in tailored suits who did not bother to lower their voices as they passed. The receptionist behind the curved desk looked at him the way one might look at a delivery driver who had wandered in through the wrong entrance, and she suggested with a practiced smile that he might find the service corridor around the side of the building more appropriate. Evan told her, calmly and without apology, that he was carrying an urgent letter intended for Graham Ashcroft alone, and something in the way he said the name made her hesitate for just a moment too long. That hesitation was enough time for Vivian Blackwood's assistant to appear from a side hallway, her heels clicking against the marble with sharp, deliberate precision, demanding that Evan hand over the envelope so it could be properly logged and delivered. Evan repeated Nathaniel's instructions word for word, that the letter was to be placed directly into Graham Ashcroft's hands and no one else's, and the assistant's expression flickered with something between irritation and unease before she turned to make a call. Evan kept his eyes forward, refusing to let the heat rising in his chest show anywhere on his face, a discipline he had learned long before he ever sat behind the controls of an airplane. He thought, briefly, of Audrey's voice on the phone that morning, of the pride she carried whenever she talked about the work he did, and it steadied him more than any argument he could have made to the assistant standing in front of him. A pair of junior executives crossing the lobby caught sight of the exchange and laughed under their breath, one of them muttering that a charter pilot was apparently staging some kind of dramatic scene to angle for a bigger tip. Bryce Harlan, standing near the elevator bank with a coffee in hand, noticed the red wax seal from across the room and immediately began typing a message into his phone, his thumb moving with the kind of urgency that had nothing to do with casual curiosity. By the time Evan was ushered toward the executive elevator, the story circulating through the lobby had already twisted itself into something unrecognizable. The ride-up gave Evan a slow, unsettling tour of Ashcroft Aeronautics history. Framed photographs lining the walls in gold-edged frames, decades of press clippings and ribbon cuttings and smiling faces beside airplanes long since retired. One photograph near the top floor stopped him cold, a black-and-white image of a much younger Graham Ashcroft standing beside a woman with a wide, confident grin, and beside them both stood a lean man with sharp eyes who Evan recognized instantly as Nathaniel Voss. It was proof, plain and undeniable, that the man who had handed him this envelope was no forgotten stranger, but one of the very people who had helped build this company from nothing. When the elevator doors slid open, Vivian Blackwood was waiting on the other side, flanked by half the board, her posture radiating the kind of authority that made entire rooms rearrange themselves around her. She looked Evan over slowly, from his boots to his jacket to the envelope pressed against his chest, and asked in a voice pitched just loud enough for the hallway to hear whether the maintenance crew had started sending representatives to executive meetings now. Evan did not flinch, and he did not answer the insult directly, instead saying only that he needed to see Graham Ashcroft immediately, that the matter could not wait for introductions or approvals. For one brief second, something shifted behind Vivian's composed expression the moment her eyes landed on the wax seal, a flicker of recognition that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a tightening around her jaw that told Evan more than any words could have. Inside the boardroom, the morning light cut hard lines across a table long enough to seat 20, and Evan felt every one of those 20 pairs of eyes settle on him as Vivian demanded, once again, that he hand over the envelope. Evan told her plainly that all correspondence addressed to the chairman had to pass through executive review first, a rule she recited as though it were carved into the building's foundation, though nothing in Evan's memory of Nathaniel's instructions allowed for that. He said, evenly, that she had no authority to open or destroy a private letter meant for Graham, and the words landed in the room like a dropped glass, sharp and impossible to ignore. A few board members laughed quietly, exchanging glances that suggested Evan simply did not understand how a multi-billion-dollar corporation actually operated, and one of them murmured something about small planes and smaller paychecks. The air in the boardroom felt colder than the tarmac had at dawn, the kind of cold that came from air conditioning and indifference rather than weather. And Evan found himself standing very straight against it, refusing to let his posture betray how tired he truly was. Vivian asked him, almost lazily, how much a man like him earned flying charter routes across the Pacific Northwest, then remarked that the number was probably lower than the cost of her lunch that day. Evan let the comment pass without so much as a change in his expression, repeating only that the letter needed to be delivered whole and unopened, exactly as he had promised Nathaniel it would be. When he took a single step forward to reclaim the envelope from her hand, Bryce Harlan signaled toward the door, and 2 security guards materialized behind Evan with the kind of speed that suggested they had been waiting just out of sight the entire time. Vivian broke the wax seal in front of everyone, the sound of cracking wax somehow louder than it had any right to be in that silent room, and the board leaned forward as one, hungry for whatever scandal or apology might spill out. She only made it through the first few lines before her face changed, the color draining slightly from her cheeks as she read Nathaniel's warning that Graham must not, under any circumstances, sign away the company's lifeline division. For a moment she said nothing at all, her eyes scanning the page a second time, as if she could will the words into meaning something different, and Clara Winslow, seated near the far end of the table, noticed the shift immediately. Then, just as quickly, Vivian's expression hardened back into its usual composed mask, and she declared to the room that the letter was nothing more than the bitter ramblings of a disgruntled former employee who had been let go years ago. Without waiting for anyone to object, she tore the paper in half, then in half again, scattering the pieces across the polished table like confetti at the end of a party no one had wanted to attend. She told the room the matter was resolved and ordered someone to escort the delivery man out of the building before he wasted any more of everyone's time. Evan looked directly at her, his voice quiet but unwavering, and told her that tearing a piece of paper did not make the truth inside it disappear, that words did not stop existing just because someone destroyed the page they were written on. Vivian smiled thinly, the expression not reaching her eyes, and told him that in her world, truth belonged to whoever held the authority to decide which documents were allowed to survive. What none of them knew, what none of them could have known, was that behind the darkened one-way glass at the back of the boardroom, Graham Ashcroft had arrived early and had been standing there the entire time, watching every second of it unfold through the internal camera feed piped quietly into his private viewing room. He did not step forward. He did not raise his voice or announce his presence, though every instinct in his aging body told him to do exactly that. Instead, Graham lifted the phone in his hand and called the head of building security in a voice so calm it startled even himself, instructing the man to ensure that no one currently on the executive floor was permitted to leave until further notice. He had suspected something rotten inside his own company for months, ever since certain financial reports had begun reading a little too smoothly, a little too convenient in their explanations, but suspicion without proof was worth nothing in a boardroom full of lawyers. Graham pressed a hand briefly against his chest, an old habit from the months following his surgery, and reminded himself that patience had served him well through 5 decades of business decisions far more complicated than this one. He thought of Evelyn then, of the way she used to say that the truth rarely needed defending, it only needed enough time and enough witnesses to reveal itself on its own. What he needed now was not a confrontation. What he needed was to see exactly how far the rot had spread and who else in that room was willing to protect it. If he walked in immediately after Vivian tore the letter, she would simply call it an impulsive mistake, apologize with practiced sincerity, and quietly dispose of whatever evidence remained before anyone thought to look for it twice. So Graham stayed hidden, watching Vivian instruct her assistant to gather the torn pieces from the table and feed them into the shredder down the hall. Watching Clara Winslow raise a quiet objection about preserving documents that might carry legal significance for the company. Vivian silenced Clara with a single pointed remark about job security, and the room fell obediently quiet, the way rooms full of frightened, well-paid people so often did. Malcolm Reddick leaned toward Vivian and suggested, in a low voice, that perhaps the meeting should be postponed given the unusual interruption. But Vivian refused outright, insisting the vote on the acquisition needed to happen before noon, no matter what. Her urgency told Graham everything he needed to know about how deeply that letter had struck a nerve she had not expected anyone to touch. Out in the corridor, Evan was led away without resistance, offering no argument as the 2 guards flanked him toward a small waiting room near the elevators. One of them, a broad-shouldered man named Walt, who had worked security at Ashcroft Tower for 11 years, muttered under his breath as they walked that he had received explicit instructions not to take Evan any farther than that room, and certainly not down to the street. Evan sat alone after the door closed behind him, uncertain whether Graham Ashcroft was protecting him or preparing some quiet form of consequence he had not yet seen coming. He thought back to Nathaniel's final instructions in the hangar, the old man's voice cracking slightly as he warned that if the letter was ever intercepted before reaching Graham, Evan needed to recite the very last line word for word, because it functioned as a kind of proof only a handful of people alive would understand. Evan had read that line once, quickly, while Nathaniel sealed the envelope, and it had stayed with him through the entire flight north. The sentence had spoken of a woman named Evelyn, and how she had never built the Lifeline program so it could become a reward for people who valued profit over human lives. Evelyn now understood from the photographs lining the elevator walls, had been Graham's late wife, the co-founder of the very division Vivian seemed so eager to sell. It was a detail so specific, so intimate, that only someone from the company's earliest founding circle could have known to include it, which meant it functioned as a kind of signature no forger could easily replicate. Evan reached into his jacket pocket and felt the small brass key still resting there, cool against his fingers, and for the first time he noticed a number etched faintly along its edge. The number read 314, and something about it tugged at his memory, a detail he had glimpsed on a brass plaque just outside the boardroom doors on his way in. Graham entered the boardroom through a private side door, only minutes after the shredded pieces had been swept away, his expression giving nothing away, his pace unhurried in the manner of a man who had spent 5 decades learning to hide exactly what he was thinking. Vivian's entire posture shifted the moment he appeared, her voice softening into warm concern as she asked about his recent cardiac treatment and whether the long flight from his coastal home had tired him. Graham thanked her for the concern and settled into his chair at the head of the table, then asked, almost offhandedly, whether any correspondence had arrived for him that morning. Vivian answered without a flicker of hesitation that nothing had come in, her voice smooth and certain, and Graham let a beat of silence pass before asking a second time, this time invoking Nathaniel Voss by name. Vivian's composure barely wavered as she suggested that Nathaniel had not been mentally sound for some time now, that he might have sent some confused stranger to disrupt the company out of bitterness over his forced retirement years earlier. Malcolm and Bryce both nodded along, confirming her version of events with the kind of practiced agreement that suggested they had rehearsed it long before that morning. Clara said nothing, watching Graham carefully, trying to read whether he already knew more than he was letting on, uncertain whether staying silent made her complicit in something she still could not fully name. Graham simply nodded and asked the room to proceed with the scheduled agenda, and Vivian, visibly relieved, launched into her presentation on the proposed sale of Ashcroft Lifeline Aviation to a firm called Apex Meridian for the sum of $2,800,000,000. She described the Lifeline division as an underperforming asset, a costly relic that no longer aligned with the company's forward growth strategy, her tone clinical and rehearsed as though she were describing spare parts rather than aircraft that ferried doctors and medicine into towns most airlines refused to serve. Bryce assured the board that Apex Meridian intended to retain every current employee for at least 3 years following the acquisition, a promise offered with the smooth confidence of a man who had made similar promises before and never once kept them. Graham asked a few quiet, unassuming questions about who actually controlled Apex Meridian at the ownership level, and Vivian's answers grew increasingly vague, sliding toward reassurances that legal counsel had already reviewed and approved every detail. Clara interjected sharply that she had never signed off on the final ownership structure of the deal, her voice carrying a firmness that surprised even her, and the temperature in the room shifted noticeably. Graham asked each board member one at a time to state their position on the acquisition aloud before any vote was taken, a request so simple it seemed almost harmless, though it forced every person at that table to reveal exactly where their loyalties stood. One by one, Vivian's allies spoke in favor of the deal, each explanation slightly too polished, each justification leaning a little too heavily on numbers rather than principle. When the last board member had finished speaking, Graham asked that the pilot waiting outside be brought into the room, and Vivian's objection erupted so forcefully, so far outside her usual controlled demeanor, that it told everyone present exactly how much she feared what Evan might say. Evan walked back into the boardroom past the same faces that had mocked him less than an hour earlier, though this time the silence that greeted him carried a different weight entirely. Graham did not introduce him by name or explain his presence, only asked what exactly he had brought to the building that morning, and Evan answered with the same steady calm that had carried him through the entire ordeal. He described the precise time Nathaniel had handed him the letter, the condition of the unbroken wax seal, and the explicit instruction that it be delivered only into Graham's hands. Vivian cut in immediately, accusing Evan of fabricating the entire story as some kind of extortion attempt against the company, her voice rising in a way that betrayed more fear than authority. Evan did not argue with her. He simply recited, word for word, the final line of the letter he had glimpsed before it was sealed, the sentence naming Evelyn and her original vision for the Lifeline program. Graham's expression changed the instant he heard it, a recognition passing across his weathered face that no amount of rehearsed denial could have produced in a stranger. Vivian insisted Evan might have overheard the phrase somewhere, perhaps from an old company newsletter or a retired employee's careless gossip, grasping for any explanation that did not implicate her further. Graham asked, quietly, whether Evan had any other proof beyond his memory, and Evan reached into his jacket and withdrew the small brass key, setting it gently on the table where the light caught the number etched into its side. Clara rose from her seat and moved toward the far end of the boardroom, running her fingers along the underside of the long table until she found what she was searching for, a small, locked compartment built into the wood itself, one that had clearly been installed decades ago and forgotten by everyone except the man who built it. Graham explained, his voice softer now, almost nostalgic, that Nathaniel had designed that compartment years earlier as a way to preserve paper copies of critical company documents in case anyone ever tried to erase them electronically. The key slid into the lock with a soft, satisfying click, and inside sat a modest wooden box that Nathaniel had apparently placed there during his final visit to the company before stepping away for good. The wood was scratched and worn at the corners, the kind of object that had clearly traveled somewhere before it ever reached this hiding place. And for a moment nobody in the room spoke, as though the box itself demanded a kind of silence. Clara lifted the lid carefully, her hands steady, despite the tension thick enough to taste, and the first thing that caught the light was a stack of papers bound with a simple rubber band, yellowed slightly at the edges from years of careful storage. Inside the box, arranged with the same careful precision Nathaniel had brought to everything he did, lay a folder listing the true shareholders behind Apex Meridian. Records of wire transfers routed through 3 separate shell companies, an internal memo outlining planned layoffs following the acquisition, and a signed agreement detailing a profit-sharing arrangement between Vivian, Bryce, and several members of the board. The documents made unmistakably clear that Apex Meridian was quietly controlled through a family trust belonging to the Blackwoods themselves, a fact Vivian had buried beneath layer after layer of legal language and shell corporations. Vivian insisted the papers could easily be forged, her voice losing some of its earlier steadiness, and Clara moved quickly to examine the notarization stamps on at least 2 of the documents, confirming within minutes that they were unmistakably authentic originals. Several of the executives who had laughed at Evan in the lobby now found it difficult to meet his eyes, shifting uncomfortably in their leather chairs as the weight of what they had witnessed began to settle over the room. Graham asked Evan, gently, why he had not simply mentioned the key the moment he arrived, and Evan explained that Nathaniel had only authorized its use if the letter itself failed to reach Graham safely. That kind of discipline, that willingness to follow instructions exactly even under pressure and public humiliation, told Graham more about the man standing before him than any resume or reference letter ever could have. Vivian recovered her composure faster than anyone expected, pivoting sharply to attack the chain of custody surrounding the documents Evan had produced. She accused him and Nathaniel of conspiring together to plant evidence in the boardroom as part of some elaborate scheme to discredit her leadership, her voice regaining its earlier sharpness. She claimed Evan was currently facing serious financial trouble and had every motive to accept payment from a rival interested in sabotaging the acquisition, and Bryce, prepared for exactly this moment, produced records showing that Evan's small charter company owed significant maintenance fees on its aging aircraft. Whispers moved quietly around the table, the kind of low murmuring that spread faster than any spoken accusation ever could, and Evan felt the shift in the room even before he saw it on any single face. A few board members hesitated visibly at that revelation, the financial pressure making Evan appear, for the first time that morning, like someone who might genuinely be for sale. Vivian remarked coolly that a man who could not afford a new uniform hardly seemed like someone the board should trust with a decision worth billions of dollars. Evan admitted openly that he was struggling financially, offering no lengthy defense or excuse, only stating plainly that poverty did not make a man corruptible any more than wealth made a person honest. Graham asked security to pull Evan's flight logs from air traffic control, and within minutes the records confirmed he had flown a direct, uninterrupted route from Montana to Seattle without a single stop or contact with anyone connected to a rival firm. The maintenance logs further showed that Evan had personally covered the additional fuel costs required to avoid a layover, simply to ensure the letter arrived before the 10 o'clock deadline Nathaniel had given him. A security camera at the small Montana airfield had also captured the exact moment Nathaniel handed over the still-sealed envelope, time-stamped hours before Evan ever set foot inside Ashcroft Tower. Cornered, Vivian shifted her story entirely, now insisting she had never actually read the letter's contents and had simply torn an empty envelope out of frustration with the interruption. Graham asked her, very deliberately, whether she was certain she wanted that statement entered into the record in front of the full board. Vivian confirmed it without hesitation, her voice firm, her expression daring anyone at that table to challenge her. Graham gave a small nod toward the head of security, and the darkened glass panel at the rear of the boardroom slowly cleared, revealing the private viewing area where he had stood watching the entire scene unfold from the very beginning. A moment later, the main screen at the front of the room flickered to life, replaying the footage in complete silence, showing Vivian breaking the wax seal, reading the warning about Evelyn's Lifeline program, and tearing the letter apart with her own hands. The room sat frozen as her recorded voice echoed from the speakers, repeating the very words she had spoken less than an hour earlier, that in her world, truth belonged only to whoever held the power to decide which records were allowed to survive. Vivian tried, briefly, to frame her actions as a necessary precaution against an unverified document threatening a sensitive negotiation, her voice thinner now, stripped of its earlier certainty. Clara pointed out, calmly but firmly, that destroying evidence after learning it related directly to a pending vote could reasonably be interpreted as obstruction of an internal investigation, and no one at the table offered a counter-argument. Graham ordered the acquisition frozen immediately and instructed the technology team to suspend Vivian's access to every internal system before the meeting even adjourned. Malcolm quickly protested that he had merely followed the recommendations of his chief executive, his voice climbing an octave higher than usual. But Graham had already anticipated exactly that kind of deflection. He played a short audio recording of a phone call between Malcolm and Bryce, one discussing the size of the bonus each expected once the Apex Meridian deal closed successfully. The board members who had laughed loudest at Evan now turned on one another, each searching for someone else to blame as the walls of their carefully built story collapsed around them. Graham did not raise his voice through any of it. He simply asked, one final time, how a tired pilot with a duffel bag and a worn jacket had managed to protect this company more effectively than people paid millions of dollars a year to do exactly that. Bryce attempted to slip toward the door as the meeting stretched past its scheduled end, but security calmly informed him that his presence would be required for the auditors and legal counsel already being summoned to the building. Vivian turned toward Evan one last time, insisting that none of this would have happened if he had simply handed her the envelope the moment he arrived, her voice trembling now with something closer to desperation than anger. Evan answered quietly that the letter had not created the conspiracy sitting underneath this company, it had only removed the last place it had left to hide. Graham formally suspended both Vivian and Malcolm from their positions effective immediately, his tone measured, almost high-sured, carrying none of the triumph one might expect from a man who had just uncovered years of betrayal. Clara was appointed to lead the company on an interim basis, though Graham made clear she would operate under the close oversight of an independent committee until a permanent decision could be reached. The entire Apex Meridian transaction was handed over to outside auditors and legal counsel, every document pulled apart line by line to ensure nothing else remained buried. Graham refused to resolve the crisis with a single dramatic firing, insisting instead on a proper legal process that would leave no opening for any of it to be challenged or reversed later. Vivian was escorted out through the very same corridor where she had once ordered Evan removed, her heels echoing against the marble in a silence that felt almost deafening compared to the confidence she had walked in with that morning. The employees who had once lowered their eyes in her presence now simply watched her pass, saying nothing at all. Later that afternoon, once the boardroom had emptied and the building had settled into an uneasy quiet, Graham asked Clara to help him carefully reassemble the torn pieces of the original letter that had been recovered before they reached the shredder. Most of what they pieced together matched the documents already recovered from the hidden compartment, confirming names, numbers, and dates that left little room for doubt. But the final paragraph, the one Vivian had never allowed herself to read past, contained something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with fraud or shell companies. Nathaniel had written that Graham had spent too many years trusting polished reports handed to him by polished people, drifting slowly away from the men and women who actually kept the company running day to day. He warned that if Graham simply removed Vivian and replaced her with another executive cut from the same cloth, the company would eventually repeat this exact mistake all over again in some different form. Nathaniel reminded him that Evelyn had built the Lifeline division to carry doctors, medicine, and patients into towns too remote and too poor for anyone else to bother reaching, and that its value could never be measured honestly on a balance sheet. Vivian had wanted to sell it precisely because its profits were thin, never once understanding that its thinness was the entire point, that it was the closest thing the company had left to a soul. Graham read the passage twice in silence before turning to Evan, asking him plainly why he had accepted a flight whose payment barely covered his fuel costs in the first place. Evan answered simply, without embellishment, that his late wife had once needed an emergency medical flight that arrived too slowly to save her, and that he had spent the years since refusing to let another family wait on a plane that never came. He had not shared the story to earn sympathy from anyone in that room, only to help Graham understand what the division Vivian had tried to sell actually meant beyond the numbers written in her presentation. Graham sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling somewhere behind his eyes, before admitting quietly that he had allowed his own company, his late wife's own creation, to become a place where men like Evan were treated as invisible. He apologized to Evan directly, in front of Clara and the handful of staff still lingering nearby, the words coming slow and unpracticed from a man unaccustomed to offering them. Evan did not ask for compensation or a title far beyond his experience, requesting only that Graham reconsider closing the smaller, less profitable routes that kept the emergency network alive, in places most people never thought about. Graham agreed without hesitation, canceling the Apex Meridian sale permanently and committing fresh investment toward restoring the company's aging fleet of rescue aircraft. It was, everyone in the room seemed to understand, the closest thing to justice this particular story was going to offer, quieter and steadier than anyone might have expected that morning. In the weeks that followed, an independent audit confirmed in full detail how Vivian and Bryce had concealed their ownership of Apex Meridian behind layers of shell entities designed specifically to survive routine scrutiny. Every board member who had personally profited from the arrangement was removed from their position and required to return the bonuses they had already collected in anticipation of the deal's closing. Clara Winslow was formally named chief executive following a transparent review process that Graham insisted be conducted entirely in the open, with no closed-door decisions and no quiet favors exchanged along the way. Graham also established a new internal ethics council made up of pilots, mechanics, ground crew, and representatives from the small communities the Lifeline program actually served. Evan was offered a newly created position as Director of Community Flight Coordination for Ashcroft Lifeline Aviation, a role built not as some extravagant reward but as a natural extension of his experience, his discipline, and the quiet purpose that had guided him for years. He accepted on one condition, that he be allowed to continue flying certain routes himself, rather than spending every day trapped behind a desk far from the runway. Within months, he had reopened several medical transport routes to remote communities that had been quietly discontinued years earlier, and he pushed through improvements to pay and safety standards for the contract pilots who flew alongside him. He visited small airstrips in towns most executives at Ashcroft Tower had never heard of, shaking hands with clinic nurses and volunteer coordinators who had spent years wondering whether anyone in Seattle still remembered they existed. In one such town, an elderly woman who ran the local pharmacy told him, through tears she did not bother hiding, that she had almost given up hope the flights would ever return, and Evan carried that conversation with him long after he climbed back into the cockpit. On his first official day in the new role, Evan walked through the lobby of Ashcroft Tower, carrying the very same worn duffel bag he had carried that first morning, his boots just as scuffed, his jacket just as faded. The receptionist who had once directed him toward the service entrance rose from her desk and offered a quiet, sincere apology, her cheeks coloring slightly with embarrassment. Evan did not use the moment to embarrass her in return, telling her only, with a small and genuine smile, that next time it might be worth listening to a person before judging them by their shoes. Graham had the reassembled letter framed and mounted inside boardroom 314, protected now beneath a sheet of glass exactly where it had once been torn apart in front of a room full of people who should have known better. Beneath it, engraved on a small brass plate, ran a single line that Graham had chosen himself. Truth does not disappear, simply because someone powerful tears it into pieces. The story closed on a quiet morning weeks later, as Evan prepared for the very first rescue flight under the newly restored program, his hands moving through the familiar pre-flight checklist with the same steady calm that had carried him through everything else. His phone lit up briefly with a message from Audrey, 4 simple words telling him she was proud of him, and Evan allowed himself a small private smile before setting the phone aside. Somewhere behind him, back on the tarmac, a young ground crew member who had heard the story secondhand raised a hand in a small, respectful wave, and Evan returned the gesture with a nod before pulling his headset into place. He looked out across the runway, stretching pale and empty before him, then eased the throttle forward, the engine rising to a low, steady roar beneath his hands. The man once dismissed as nothing more than a delivery driver in a cheap uniform was now the one entrusted with protecting the very mission that people in tailored suits had once been so eager to sell away, and somewhere far below, the letter they had tried to destroy hung quietly on a wall, unbroken, exactly where the truth belonged.
You could walk away. I was ascended to deity by one. Who are you to stand against me? Still think you're rock solid?
Hold on. Damn, bro. This definitely like cancels your shit out.
That's a familiar trick. You won't
There we go.
burn the temple down.
Damn. Damn.